welcome to 7 Minutes in Heaven with Chip Wilson. I'm Chip Wilson. Today we'll be talking about the topic of orality and its presence in our current day society. In ancient cultures, orality was the only way of communicating information. This is largely the result of an illiterate society where information could not be retained or stored. There are two kinds of orality that have existed, primary and secondary. Primary oral societies are untouched by literacy and rely on the self for recall and preservation of knowledge. Secondary orality incorporates literacy but still uses aspects of primary orality. Walter Ong, a professor and historian, classified certain characteristics that defined what a primary oral society looked like. Today we will outline a few of those characteristics and their modern day parallels. Many of these will pertain to our media culture today. Here's Afrin with our first connection.
Hi, I'm Afrin Mirzadeh. The first characteristic of orality that will be mentioned in 7 minutes is agnostically toned. This aspect can be outlined as the lifeblood of orality. It uses stories of heroism and villains to convey meaning through its contrasting themes. This was used in oral societies as a mnemonic tool that recalled a particular story or thought that helped the speaker relay meaning to his audience. We still see elements of this mnemonic recall in modern society. Just recently, there was a terrorist attack in our nation's Capitol building. Since 9/11, terrorism has been a constant theme in Western media. The talking point in our news and politics has to do with stories of good versus evil, or us versus the terrorists. Many times it feels like if the nation doesn't stand with national ideals, it is seen as unpatriotic.
You are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
Obviously, terrorism is often debated about in our news media. Getting back to the recent shooting in Ottawa, the nation held its breath as the Capitol building was under attack by shooter Michael Zahaf-Babeau, which ultimately led to his death at the hands of Sergeant-at-Arms Kevin Vickers. Vickers' actions were portrayed as an act of heroism in the news. He was celebrated by Ottawa government officials with a lengthy standing ovation. The news media supported Vickers' actions and saw it as the right thing to do. However, how much of this has to do with our Western ideologies? On the other hand, the extremist beliefs of Zahaf-Babeau are commonplace outside the Western world. In the Middle East, Michael Zahaf-Babeau was most likely seen as a martyr for his actions. Another characteristic of orality that can still be found in present day is the news media's ability to cover stories that are close to the human life world. In past oral societies, memory retention was a valuable asset because information couldn't be stored outside the self. Having to internalize extraneous information was irrelevant and unnecessary in a primary oral society. Because of this, thought was shaped around ideas having to do with relevant practical life. Presently, the news media uses this tactic in relaying information regarding the world around us. They mainly focus on stories that can impact the most amount of people. The more relevant the story is to the society it takes place in, the more viewership the media outlet obtains. Stories like mass health pandemics and threats to national security are given more attention by news outlets. However, the idea of informing a society is secondary to the revenue generated by advertising. Profit generated by marketing within news broadcasts ultimately pays for the news programs, but ultimately creates a bias in the information presented.
To continue the idea of advertising, Ong's characteristics of redundancy can be applied in modern-day societies. Ong's explanation of redundancy when referring to primary oral societies is defined as being the repetition of information as to be able to be retained in the human brain, as opposed to having a text on a page where a person could backloop and reread the information. People of primary oral societies didn't possess the ability to do so because as soon as the word is spoken, the sound vanishes and there is no way of retrieving it. This being the case, the mind must move slowly and keep attention to the information being communicated. Furthermore, this characteristic can be seen in the modern-day advertising, where advertising companies rely on the repetition of words or ideas to create a lasting recognition of information. For example, commercials on television are constantly replayed as the repetition of these images and sound become retained in the minds of the audience. The method of product placement and the repetition of such can be seen in music videos, movies, television shows, and even news broadcasting. On top of the redundancy of product placement in the news itself can be redundant with the repetition of stories and concepts. It happens all the time in the world. I just can't really think of an example how it affects me. I mean, I study it, right? So I'm kind of immune to it. But I will come back with one next time.
My name is Devin McDonald. My area of expertise in the study of communications is orality, specifically the characteristic of traditionalist versus conservative. In traditional oral societies, one of the methods of retaining information is the conservative or traditionalist characteristic. The definition of this ideology is to preserve information based around the importance of that information. The knowledge that was deemed in being helpful for future generations was passed down. Historically, primary oral societies passed down knowledge within small groups. Select older men and women were chosen to be the holders of knowledge, which they then passed down within these societies. In this quote from Ong, he states that in primary oral societies, knowledge is hard to come by and precious, and society regards highly those wise old men and women who specialize in conserving it, who know and can tell the stories of the days of old. The knowledge that the elders passed down was deemed to be the truth because it was the only information they had access to. Currently, this characteristic can be applied to broadcast news. When gathering our news, we believe that what the journalist is telling us to be the truth. The journalists and broadcast companies are selective in the content they choose to feature. This can create a bias in the media depending on the external influences of the broadcast. Elders in primary oral societies would have also created a bias in the information passed down that would frame situations to their own personal bias.
And there you have it. Our experts have outlined a few of Ong's characteristics and how they relate to our world today. Other scholars have found connections to oral societies within their work. Marshall McLuhan is a Canadian communications theorist who wrote about orality in his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, in which he outlines the idea of a global village. McLuhan states that oral tradition isn't dead, and that children are of course illiterate, and many of their negotiations in day-to-day life parallel oral-based societies. Children are taught such things as nursery rhymes, poems, and songs by memory. This is also true within religious communities where children are taught passages and hymns from a very early age, usually due to the rhythmic nature of the pieces. This is of course relatable to mnemonic patterns that guide the thought of pre-literate societies and many of the characteristics outlined above by Walter Ong. According to McLuhan, once a child learns to read and write, the child enters a manuscript culture that enables him to progress through to literacy. Thank you for tuning into this episode of 7 Minutes in Heaven with Chip Wilson. I've been Chip Wilson. We hope you've learned a lot about orality and the related characteristics in modern culture. We would like to thank our experts and scholars for contributing to our investigation. Stay tuned for another episode of To Catch a Predator with Chris Hansen.